Action. All right, Matthew 28, start in a familiar place. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. This is number 7 in our sequence of studies here. And you can find them on YouTube, I'm sure. Number 7. So this asks, we've been talking about discipleship, discipleship, what is a disciple, all those things. All that's going to kind of converge today in number 7. How can I know that I'm following Jesus, right? Not how can I know that I'm a follower of Jesus, but how can I know that I'm following Jesus? I want to start with 28, 18 through 20. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And behold, or lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. You'll notice, well, you may not notice, right? But there are 3 participles there. Go, as it said here, go, therefore, that's a participle. Going, baptizing, and teaching. But, this is a legitimate translation, right? And, well, aren't you grateful, right, for that? But this is in the sense that it may have the force of an imperative, is why it's translated this way. But the command there is to make disciples. And that's what may not be readily apparent, when you read this. It isn't a suggestion, or is it like, hey, here's the general picture of what, that's the command, and then it's supported by three participles. But the purpose of discipleship, we're talking about discipleship, the purpose of discipleship then is to follow Jesus. We could just say it that succinctly. Essence of discipleship then is following Jesus. It's one thing to know the purpose of something. You contemplate the purpose, but it's another thing to align one's thinking, one's behavior with the acknowledged purpose for one's life, right? What's the acknowledged purpose of my life? So acknowledge is a step beyond just realizing something or having some eye-opening realization, because you could, realize something and then fail to acknowledge or personally come to terms with it. So the full weight of its value or significance, in other words, in my life. So if I say discipling, discipleship, following, all those types of words, I may get conceptually what that is, but then to acknowledge it is something that I need to own for myself. That's quite a different thing. So it's one thing to know the truth, another thing to realize the truth factually. It's altogether another thing then to acknowledge the truth, to accept the truth in terms of its personal significance. That's true of anything. It's not just discipleship. It's true of literally every page or doctrine or something we could find in Scripture. So the truth is then my or your relationship to Jesus is fully atoned as a fully atoned for child of God, characterized by this disciple-master relationship. Simple way to ascertain that is to look here. Matthew 28, 19, for example, where Jesus commanded his disciples, and he spoke to them, saying, So he is commanding his disciples to make disciples from all peoples. So in Greek, it's ta ethne, which you may know. Ta ethne, it's a reference then to what? Not just to, really to all non-Jewish populations then. And some of the translations, like this one, will say disciples of all nations. And that's also a legitimate translation. Maybe peoples, to all peoples, but perhaps, we might hesitate to translate it that way because it's a bit awkward, for the average person. Nations, though, can be awkward as well because it can basically say national boundaries. And we can look at, then that's this many. If it's 270 nations, who knows what the latest count is? It changes every day, right? So, it's not referring precisely to national, but it's really referring to what do we mean by nation. And when you use the word nation, you just genuinely mean the confluence of cultures and ethnic groups, whatever, that sort of come together in a particular, and then we say that's a nation, all those types of things. But anyway, he's saying, we're honing in on the verb here, is basically this verb mathetuo, which then, so manthano is going to be the disciple, mathetuo is the action disciple. So you don't even need the word make on there. Make disciples, a little superfluous, but helps us understand. But it's literally, if somebody came up to you and said, hey, go disciple that person, what would you assume is would be the fulfillment of that? What's included in that command? But that's the idea. Jesus is saying disciple. Disciple from all, we could say ethno-linguistic groups, something like that. What are there? Some, arguably maybe, depending how one counts, 15, 20,000, kinds of specific people groups. And people groups are not bound by any particular national, kind of border in that regard. But anyway, we'd say, disciple this person or that person. And it's this idea of helping them to become a disciple, in essence. So we're asking today, well, in a sense, so there's a process involved in that. So we'll distinguish between I'm a follower and I'm following. Those are kind of two things, like saying I'm a disciple of Jesus, but am I being discipled? In that type of thing. In other words, I'm, and we don't want to get in the weeds on all of that, but there's a process kind of involved in that. So we could even ask of ourselves, well, have I been discipled? Am I discipling others? And all this. So I just want to look at a little bit here at the outset. Common understanding of this passage. As a matter of fact, it's called the Great Commission, right? You either have the Great Commission or the Great Omission, but say the Great Commission, whatever, right? So it's a label. Let's slap it on this, what you have, because of what we believe is implied, or what is inferred from the text that we imply, and that is, well, we should be out evangelizing the nations, right? And so we'll say, does this sense of evangelizing the nations carry over to any place other than Matthew? And then we could do that. It's easy. You see, like Mark 16:15 or Luke 24:45 to 49, John 20:19 to 23, and then we jump over to like Acts chapter 1:8. And so there you go. There's some pretty solid evidence that this isn't a one and done or a one-off here, but this is a general expectation that Jesus had for his disciples. Now, we want to be careful though about limiting the force of the command to sharing the gospel alone. But we think, okay, what is involved in it is sharing the gospel to elicit a response. That's ultimately what we want. If we share the gospel with someone, what kind of response? And it's always a yes or no. Sometimes it's, I need a little more. Please, let's have a conversation about this. But generally speaking. But I will tell you that there's a school of thought somewhat that what Jesus is advocating here is just go and evangelize to elicit a response, but some might say to elicit a decision, right? So we can become very, very decision-based in our methodology, and yet the command here is not go and make decisions, go and elicit decisions like that. So it's actually deeper than that. Of course, we know that there are decisions involved in this process somewhere, but then that rather excludes or limits the understanding of making disciples to just hearing the gospel and making a decision either for or against, but it includes those that will favorably respond. What about their training? That there's the training. You're entering into a whole life, this life with Christ. It's more than just, what's the difference between that and using the analogy of you've entered through the doorway and now you're officially inside. And maybe it's a beautiful museum, let's just say. I've been treated to museums all over the place, because people think I like that or something. So, okay, hey, Douglas, here's some new museum about this. Now, I could have a ticket that I'm inside. But unless somebody guides me through the whole thing and I go into all these places, I really can't appreciate the fullness of it. And this is the idea of the Christian life, So Jesus' atoning work on the cross, And we've just come through this time where we really consider more intently his death, his burial, his resurrection, our justification, our redemption, things of this nature that apply to us. And yet people will make a decision. They will enter into the Christian life, but then it's a question of being discipled in it, right? And this is a whole interesting, lots of permutations on this. So, there are people that, so someone that makes a decision, follow Christ, surrender their life to him, however we want to define this or describe it, that what happens if they're not discipled? I mean, really, and you can just imagine how difficult that could be because, they could face challenges, they just don't have any framework from this. All they know is that I was offered forgiveness of sins full and free, and I took that and I received that, but now I've got all kinds of questions. I'm confused. Why is this happening to me? Why am I feeling this way? What's going on? What's going on in my life? All these questions. This is where discipleship comes in. This is what Jesus is talking about, and some of these participles have to do with, identification, or it has to do with teaching and instruction. It has to do with going and replicating yourself and finding others to disciple and so on. Take for example, and we say to elicit a response, a response, and then what? And then if it's favorable, as people say, sure, yeah, that's for me. There's a favorable response, and then what? If we just looked at Peter and in the day of Pentecost, and just finding, where can we find a passage in Scripture that fleshes this out a little bit, And I would say look at Peter's strong appeal there in Acts chapter 2, and just find out what happens, what's going on this day. So God delivers a message to the crowds, God himself. Right. So in Acts chapter 2, outside of Peter getting up and preaching, his wasn't the first message. So the first message is God's message, and God delivers the message in a manner to attract attention and to induce some kind of experience. And that's exactly what happens, right? I mean, God got their attention, right? There's cloven tongues of fire. There's the sound of a mighty rushing wind, and all these kinds of things. Yet that which draws our attention, that which induces our experience, at the same time requires explanation, I mean, right? So Jesus would be out there, his parables, people would see incredible things that were awe-inspiring, so they have this kind of experience associated with this, but that's a far cry from actually understanding who is this guy, what's going on? And so without that kind of explanation, and a lot of that fell upon his disciples then to go out and please explain, who I am, and things of this nature, and then link that to Israel's protracted state of sin, their need to repent, he's the Messiah, what that means, and so on. Okay, so just getting back to Pentecost, and so here's the effects of the Spirit's outpouring upon the 120 disciples that are present there. They had been praying in the upper room. Now these things transpire. But then there were others there as well, and we noted this some weeks ago. There were Jews, there were proselytes, they were gathered in the temple precincts, and according to Acts chapter 2 and verse 7, they became startled, into this state of wonder. So on the one hand, you got this response, not a favorable response to the gospel, because this revelation isn't that clear at all. There's nothing salvific about it in those terms. So they become startled, state of wonder. At what? Well, here you have xenolalia, right? In case we're not familiar with that, but I'm sure we all are. It's this ability to speak an unknown language. A person who's speaking a known language, but it's unknown to them. That kind of thing we call xenolalia, right? So here, somebody speaking a language of a different kind, literally, is what it means. And so this always is quite profoundly startling, to people who have come from these other Roman provinces. Obviously, they came in for Passover, stayed in the city, some 7 weeks until Pentecost, And these are speakers of other languages. Now they're hearing these Galileans speak their dialects, speak their language, and things of this nature. But it is a unified theme. Okay, so we know it's a known language of some kind because it could be interpreted, could be translated, could be understood by native speakers of the language. You had native speakers of the language. You had speakers of the language, but it wasn't native to them, wasn't their first language, something like that, nor had they learned it. But what are they speaking? The mighty works of God. Isn't it like they were just saying, the mighty works of God? But there were things associated with the mighty works of God that they were articulating. And so here's the Spirit's coming upon them. We have what technically is called inspired speech because it's induced by the Spirit. There's this involuntary kind of profusion of praise to God. Would have been something amazing to see, right? You know, I've been in some Indian, let's say, populations where I'm just preaching, and I tend to emote a little when I preach, and the response, you know, out here, people are, you know, it's amazing. I mean, we've had them all stand up, you know, and like this, and I never was really entirely sure what induced that, like what was going on there that caused them, and all of a sudden you have this effect. But imagine on the day of Pentecost, and all these things are happening, and people are observing this, not just the 120, but there are other people that are observing what's happening to the 120, all issuing forth this speech. It seems that they've just been captured and captivated by the Spirit of God, and this thing is happening, I'm guessing, in a rather involuntary way, you know, because nobody chose to do these certain things. Like the Spirit came, the Spirit filled them, and then boom, here's evidence that the Spirit has come. It's as involuntary as a physical wind coming and blowing on a tree. That tree doesn't say, I think I should bend now, you know. So it's that kind of a thing that's happening here. So great. But then there was, and we still don't have a favorable response yet. We only have a response of like wonder, but that doesn't necessarily follow that it was going to be a favorable response to Peter's message that is going to follow. And then you have those that scorned it, right? You know, oh, they're filled with new wine. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 13, no, they're filled with new wine. And so Peter then, there's a necessity of an explanation now, right? So here's God's message, but it isn't a message in terms of verbal, you know, a verbal type of, nevertheless, you have to say, what was God communicating with these actions? What was God trying to do? And some of it became verbalized in this people saying, you know, the mighty works of God, or praising God for all kinds of things. Must have been quite a thing to experience. But then there's the need for explanation, and this is Peter's role. So Peter steps up now, and what he does is basically explain. You know, like, okay, so you say they're not drunk with new wine. You say that, but how do you know that? And now Peter says, well, for example, you know, if you good temple-going, Torah-studying Jewish folks, how about Joel? Anybody ever heard of the prophet Joel? You know, and so this is what he does, and he takes off on a prophecy that's being fulfilled there. Okay, so all this stuff we know pretty well. But then what follows in Luke's narrative here underscores the difference between making decisions and making disciples. So you come through this whole process, and we do find that there are those that respond favorably. Men, brethren, what do we do? And you'd have to put an exclamation, or at least I would put an exclamation point there, because these are guys that are not asking. Peter's presented the gospel now, and he's put Jesus front and center, but not the Jesus that was recently put on a cross and put in a tomb, but the Jesus who's alive and is both judge is the judge of humanity, right? And who in fact is alive. So, you know, in great desperation for their own souls, they're saying, man, brothers, what do we do? What do we do? So we have a group there that is favorable, and we find that they decide favorably. So there's a decision, and these are just very objective insights, right? It's not like, we're trying to think spiritually what happened to them. And we're not even going there, but we're just saying, okay, we see that they made a decision, but then how does Luke describe this? Of all the details that Luke could include here, can you imagine everything that happened at Pentecost? He could spend chapters just on, this and whatever, but he focuses the scene very strictly on, see, there was a decision. What happened after the decision? Well, they all went back to their provinces. But in fact, you don't find that. Well, I think what is really intriguing about this when you read the book of Acts is that these are people that made a decision for Christ, if we say it this way, right? They surrendered to the truth of the message that they heard, and maybe is a better way to say it. And yielded their will to the truth that they heard. They acknowledged it was true. They bent their will to it. They accepted it. Great. Then what? And you see the massive transformation. Because these are people that have already been 7 weeks, and now they're like, we're camping out here. Look at verses 42 to 47 without reading all these, but you'll see that there's a particular verb there. It's a present tense verb that they devoted or they pursued the apostles' teaching. You see that? So, but this again wasn't like they set their hearts on devoting it we should really ask some questions. Could we have a little Q&A? Could we put together like a focus group, have a little Q&A, find a little bit more what this Christian life is and where are we all going? What's your master plan for all this? No, this is something that gives the indication that this was this kind of daily set upon activity that they're doing. And then there were 4 areas. You see the 4 areas of discipline that follow, right? And those are pretty discreetly arranged, but they're arranged in couplets of 2. So you have those. And that's always an interesting study. And I've done in another place at another time, a little bit of work in this area, which is basically to make some reasonable assumption as to what that teaching was. There's some homework for you. So what was that teaching? It just says they pursued the teaching and then limited it to these sort of disciplines. But yet, and part of that I think is a reasonable apologetic, for these new believers. Like, I can imagine that front and center would be the correlation of the Messiah and what the Torah and let's say the Jewish writings, or what we call the Old Testament, and how those speak with regard to the claims of the Christian faith and the claims of Christ. And I think this would be one key area, that whether these folks are literate, whether they're carrying around the Septuagint, and how this, the Hebrew Bible speaks to this phenomena, speaks to the new covenant. Because it wasn't like, the apostles could say, sure, let's open up to the book of whatever. Where are they, right? So you don't have at this early date. And I think a lot of this is going on, but they are to be disciples. They would stay on. And then think of the problems, and Luke thinks through this, right? And he orders the text this way, because what would be the problem? You have more and more decisions, more and more disciples in need of discipleship, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff is going on. And in Jerusalem, and no beautiful place like this to meet, we got lots of room. Oh yeah, we got overflow. We'll put them over in the gym. We got plenty of room. No problem. They're all meeting in houses, right? And there's not going to be for at least 2 centuries, if not 3, a building, a basilica that's just erected for the purpose of worship. None of that. And there's no big, so they might be meeting out by the temple precincts. They're doing, whatever they got to do, right? And they're drawing large crowds, and they're drawing the attention of. Pretty soon they're going into homes and things of this nature. But what kinds of problems? That's one problem, is where are you going to meet? The other problem is, where am I going to sleep? And what am I going to eat, right? And so what does it say, very, very early on, that they had everything in common? This was not like a hard, fast rule or law that's what the Christians should be, a very communal group. They should live in communes. They should work together, eat together, and provide for each other's needs. And we just stockpile everybody's wealth in one place, and then it's all disseminated. This was a practical solution to a very real problem, and it was all underscored by this principle of love. Just put it that way. This is another one of the less obvious manifestations of this coming of the Spirit, right? So where was selfishness? Where was anything? You see this. You see this love permeating outside of all of the sensational aspects of it and the awe-inspiring aspects. And imagine this now going into the latter part of the first century, into the second century, into the third century, with Roman persecution, with Christians being martyred, and so on. What was one key, and you can look at some of the patristic writings and you can see some of this, what was one key element of the Christians was, whereas the Roman government was certainly not like, let's say, our government in sort of entitlements and social net, everything. No. Who was providing that? The Christians. Not just for themselves, but they were going outside to pagans and whatever. This was a massive thing that drew a lot of attention towards Christianity. Was this? But anyway, you see this love, and it begins here, right? Their love and their care for one another, and this to serve the practical purpose of being able to permit this discipleship. I mean, what are they going? But notice, these are people new to the faith that were so transformed by what they had heard in the truth of this that they were convinced. Nobody told them, "Oh yeah, but you got to stay because we're having discipleship classes over here, so you got to stay." And this was just organic. This was just what was okay, and they're not going anywhere. We're staying put. We're staying right here, and so all of this to facilitate the staying. And you see this and then you'll read Acts a little differently. If you start reading through it like this, and you'll see, because you're going to come to Barnabas, right? So what does Barnabas do? And Barnabas probably just epitomizes this, in terms of what he sells. And I could sell some things. We could do this. This is why Luke is including. Why would Luke include all of that? Like, if it wasn't to be enduring, something of a normative nature, like, I'm going to include that here because Christians now from here on out have got to be sure that they pool all their finances together, pool all their physical assets together, sell off everything, live in a commune. If that's not it, then what's he saying? He's saying discipleship is important, is what he's saying. Discipleship. It isn't just go forth and whatever you got to do with that gospel message, get a decision, but it's don't forget the other side of the coin. There's decision making, but there's disciple making. And when Jesus said, go and make disciples, or disciple them, it assumes that there will be a favorable response, because if he says, disciple from peoples of every ethno-linguistic group. So that's a global vision, but look positively on this. Is Jesus going to say, disciple them if there aren't going to be any? So we get this notion that wherever he is depositing believers around the world, right here in Fulton County, it presumes that there's a people, however we look at this theologically, if we bend our brains around it, there's a people that God is calling out. There is a people. And, it's not an accident that he positions us wherever he's positioned us to bear witness, right? But it's the idea that there's decisions because you've presented the gospel clearly, effectively, and you've elicited a response. There's been a favorable response, whatever the percentage of that is, there's a favorable response, and that favorable response means someone has to be discipled, right? So that discipleship should be this organic, this organic kind of process we're going to see going forward. I mean, we fast forward to the end, and you're seeing that discipleship is more observational than it is kind of verbal and instructional. So you're going to need that. But it's very observational, because if you're following the, and we'll get to this in due course, but if you're following this model that Jesus certainly adapted, this tripartite model that the rabbis used, and you see that the first two stages were basically foundational, instructional, but the third phase was only for kind of these elite and exceptional that came in and actually lived with the rabbi 24/7, observed him with an idea of becoming exactly like him. And it was this model. See, Jesus had already been through the first two stages after 3 years with his disciples. He says, I've already laid the foundation with you guys, so why is it in Matthew 16:24 that he's saying, if any to his disciples, if any of you desire to come after me, behind me, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow. So he's calling them to the third and most exclusive phase that the rabbis use, and they would understand that and what that is. So it starts with this notion that discipleship is necessary, and discipleship is durative or enduring. So let's look at firstly the essence of following. And we have to look back at 16:24, if you find your way there. You probably have it memorized anyway by now. But we're looking really here at that third imperative, right? So Jesus says, deny yourself, aorist tense, take up your cross, aorist tense, follow me, present tense. Talking about something that's enduring. So we want to recall those imperatives. Those imperatives are aorist tense, which basically means, is there a difference when you decide something between being very resolute and determined, or when you just say, okay, I'll take this one over that one, right? So this is written in such a way that to deny yourself, to take up your cross, these are settled decisions, right? Settled decisions. I've made up my mind there, denied, there, taken up. But it's to make this kind of settled decision. So one who determines to walk this path with Jesus lives a selfless, self-sacrificing life, putting the needs and concerns of others before one's own, doing so by carrying a cross. And this would be, in our understanding, this tangible reminder of one's identity and one's ministry. Crosses can be symbols for a lot of things, but if you're carrying it, and of course, he didn't ask them to carry a physical cross. He would. But it's basically say, who am I? This cross tells me my identity. This cross tells me my mission. And then to proceed to keep on following him as one who has denied themselves decisively, and one who has decisively taken up that cross. So when you see him going through the streets, not hanging on the cross, but going through the streets carrying this cross, this is a picture of us each and every day following him. So this third of these three imperatives, to follow him, is given in succession, 1, 2, and 3. So it's like how can I follow if the issue of autonomy and control or allegiance and devotion is not yet settled? It's almost like, yeah, okay, denied. Yeah, I did that. Fine. Take up. Yeah, okay, I did that. Now let's just get on with the following, right? So the idea, these are very, very powerful, but the idea of settled, this kind of settledness and determinate nature in which we follow. So if I'm still wrestling with who's in control, I'm not following. It's just that simple. I didn't say you lost your salvation, you're not a follower of Jesus, or you're not a disciple. I'm just saying you're not actively following if you're wrestling with him about who's in control of your life, or if I'm wrestling him, to put it that way as well. How can I follow then if there lingers even an ember of the self that can be flamed into this kind of personal or zeal for personal glory, something like that. Remember Paul saying, God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to it. 6:14 of Galatians. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Right? This is Paul, Galatians 2:20. How can one follow without a daily discipline, for example? So Luke chapter 9 and verse 23 adds the word daily then. Deny yourself, take up your cross daily and following. I'm not saying I shouldn't say it adds, but he includes that. It was present in the original. It wasn't like Luke was embellished. Oh, let me make this a little stronger. Jesus, you weren't strong enough there. Let me just add another word. But I think Luke, in his perspective of this whole exchange, says, yeah, this is something in our following. We do so carrying. So you had to decide at some point that I reject myself. I take up this cross. Now it's taken up. I don't keep taking it up. It's taken up. So the picture here is of a very deliberate choice. And you take it up. And now as someone who rejects themselves and has taken up a cross, is bearing this cross, now I'm following. I keep on following in this condition. Precisely what Jesus is saying here. So it's a daily. The weight of that cross, and understandably, this is not a physical cross, but the weight of this, the burden of this, should remind us to be faithful, to walk faithfully, to not wander from the path. It's only when the first two imperatives become a matter of settled resolution, settled determination, that the third may be enjoined. I give you a for example from Paul in Titus chapter 2, just to show the relation of the aorist and the settledness. Titus 2, and you know this passage, verse 11, for the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, teaching us that, you see this? Teaching us that, denying ungodliness. Now this sounds like, oh, I see. This is a present, every day we have to deny ungodliness kind of thing. This is the aorist tense. It's an aorist participle, actually. So what you'd say is, teaching us that having denied ungodliness and worldly lusts, decisively, resolutely, we then are to live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age. But you will not live a sober, righteous, and godly life in the present age unless you first determined and resolved to deny ungodliness. And this is what Jesus is saying here. You following me? Nah, there's no following unless there's a rejection. Let's just say it that way because it's much stronger, but it's really what the word deny means. I reject myself. This does not fly in our culture. And if you're sharing this with someone who's like, yeah, no, like what are you talking about? Like sounds like you all need some counseling or something. I mean, really? Who ever heard of, where did it say self-deprecation, right? That's not what we're talking about. This is almost like altruism, in its truest form, right? So we're not saying think low about yourself, go around thinking how worthless you are. That's entirely contradictory to the Christian faith, right? That says you are God's most prized possession. What is it, 2:10 of Ephesians? For you are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works that God has before ordained that we should walk in them, right? And you could call each other God's piece of work if you want, but that's literally what that means. But it really means God's masterpiece in the Greek. It's God's masterpiece. And a masterpiece is such that when you see it, you don't think, yeah, that's pretty good, but I'd put a little more color here, I'd put the shading. No, it means that this thing, it's perfect just as it is. That's it. That is the quintessential landscape of that, whatever it is in the art world, right? Jesus says, follow me. This is present tense, which we've said. In a strict literal sense, we've noticed that, there were those that were literally following him. If you go to Matthew, don't do it, but 4:19 and 20, Luke 5:11. Remember, they left their nets and what? Followed him. That was literal. I mean, they're little, they aren't following him in the sense of this kind of level of discipleship that we're talking about, but this is where it's used. Jesus says, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men, although it's not until verse 20 that you get the sense that they followed him, this verb akolatheo, right? So they're following him. But the literal rendering, though, does help us because it means that you sort of forsake this, whatever you were doing prior to the following, and you forsake that. And you get the sense of this, right? Because it says also in Matthew 4 where they left their net. So they're leaving their nets. They leave their occupations. They just leave everything to accompany this person. That's the essence of following. I forsake whatever is important to me, whatever is of some perceived value to me, and then I start. There comes an end to this, and then a beginning of this, and I start following it. I'm just going to accompany him, right? And that's, the basic concept of discipleship. Now, we have to say this because, how many times have we heard, so you abandon this, you take up this path, it's not on a temporary or trial basis. But how many times have you heard this, right? Somebody is, I'll say well-meaning to be gracious, but somebody who's well-meaning says, you just need to try Jesus. Just try it. Have you ever heard this? I mean, we've all heard this, right? Where somebody says, we just need to try it, especially somebody who's fairly negative about the Christian. Well, come on, in this sort of a pragmatic approach, but just try it. You'll never regret it. You'll see. You won't be disappointed in that type of thing. Yeah, that's a little backwards, a lot backwards to the gospel, because the gospel isn't a trial and error, try it if you like it, try it out, take it for a test drive, something like that. It's all trust driven. That's what we're appealing to people with the message. So following Jesus is represented then in that present tense command. Jesus is saying, decisively put your interests last, take up the disciplines associated with discipleship daily, and keep on following me in this selfless and humbled condition. Now that's my expanded translation of that, but I really believe this is what Jesus is saying. So that's rather abstract, and it needs to be, that clock goes, okay. So it's abstract, but it needs to be fleshed out a little bit. So I'd invite you to look at Paul, for example. I take the example of the Apostle Paul. You have in his pre-Christian days, here he is known as Saul of Tarsus, right? He's acting as a religious zealot. He's seeking to extinguish this Christian movement wherever it can be found. All kinds of passages in Acts and Galatians 1:23, he attests to that. But he learned through that process what it is to be. See, he brought a lot of this into the Christian life, but he learned through all of that what it is to be a disciple, right? Because if you look at Acts 22:3, it says of Paul, he says, well, he's going to give a little bit of his heritage. It says, I'm educated at the feet of Gamaliel. Remember this is what it says, educated at the feet. So the verb having been educated is this, paiduo. Paiduo, which a paideon is a student. We get the word pedagogy from that for all the teachers in the room, right? So it's this idea that there's teachers and there's students and there's this relationship between the two, but once that relationship starts, it is to be completed to the full. No parts of the curriculum can be skipped like Mandy, you've got your second graders there, and they don't have the option to opt out of this or opt. There's this idea. This is the entirety of what you want to teach them. So in a vocational sense, this mathetes, or this pupil, this who we are, disciples, is a learner. So if you, and in the classical literature, I started looking at some of that and seeing some examples outside of the New Testament, and it could be somebody who's an artisan, it could be somebody who's a musician, it could be even certain philosophical schools. You surrender to the rigor of this curriculum, to whatever it takes to become that. So a lot of times for orientation of a new school year, I'll stand on one side of the room and walk to the other side of the room. And I said, this is where you are. This is where we would like you to be. For example, if you profiled, to redeem that term, if you profiled like what your expectations are of a graduate of this program will be over here, and you state all those things, and then over here they're saying, yeah, that's not where I am right now, right? Well, that's no problem, because this whole line in between is called the curriculum, So you have the books and the whatever, then you have all the co-curricular stuff that reinforces all that, all the ministry opportunities and the service to one another, the spiritual growth and through chapels and any number, and discipleship and mentoring, all the stuff you pack in to that period of time to get them from there to here. So put that with anything, anything. If you're a carpenter, if you're a plumber, if you're an electrician, kind of just show up the first day and say, hey, so what do you say? I want to be. He's going, well, let me tell you. What do? We have apprentice, we have journeyman and master craftsmen, right? And that doesn't happen overnight. So you apply that to discipleship, and it's the same thing is applied. That mathetes is sort of the apprentice. And when someone first comes into the Christian life, comes into the family of God, they're this apprentice. And imagine, as an apprentice, you're facing the headwinds of what a master craftsman would have to do, and what would happen to you? Because imagine, you sign up with and I know absolutely zero about any of this, but you sign up. Oh, I'm thinking when they put that new boiler in back here, and remember they came in with all those parts, and and I was like, okay, if it were Doug, like having to put those, I can use some tools. I'm not bad. I can use some tools, even some plumbing and wrenches or whatever. I can do some of that stuff. I can't do that, right? That's going to take, and the guy that did it, I won't say his name public, but the guy that did it, amazing, right? Just amazing, absolutely amazing. So that's us, and so imagine you abandon this new believer to face the headwinds of the master craftsman stuff. But they've had no orientation to all this. And then we have the gall to point at somebody who wasn't discipled and say something, oh, but look at them, and I saw them this, and I saw them that. Well, really? Where's the love in that? Where's the love and the care, right? So Gamaliel, Paul learned this at the feet of Gamaliel, and without going into a lot of background on that, Gamaliel had two sides. Two sides. He had a Hebrew. Let's say he took his school, 500 of these that were being taught the Torah in Hebrew, then 500 over here that are being taught Greek philosophy in Greek. Believe it or not. So he's got these two wings of the thing. This is why Paul. Really, Paul must have been, because he's probably a teenager. Paul's probably a teenager, and I can, give you some interesting stuff to read about that, about how his journey from Tarsus, probably as a young man living in Jerusalem and so on, and then kind of swept up into the vortex of all this. He must have been a prodigy in that regard. Somewhat of a prodigy. Maybe not to use that term, but, if you got through the first two levels of basic discipleship, to call it that way, in Judaism, and you were selected out of that because you had done so well, to then, it's not like applying to college, and so on. Some rabbi will take you. No. You had to show already that you had the chops, to do this. And so Paul was just an amazing, like let's say Saul in this regard, right? He would have had quite an amazing record already, but here he is studying, and that's why he makes this case of who he was, and then he explains all this in Philippians chapter 3, 1 through 6, tells I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and gives his pedigree as a Jew, everything that so just appreciate where we're going with this. Everything that Paul said, this is, Papa's going too long. Everything that he said, Paul said that this is what I was, this is who I am now, a follower of Jesus. But look, if the idea of the disciple is you leave this behind to pursue this, what did Paul leave behind? And he uses the analogy, the nautical stuff of having thrown this stuff overboard to save the ship. And so he says, what I left behind was all my credits and credentials that had to do with Judaism. I left that all behind that I might know him, the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. Does that sound like deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me? Right? So he is the embodiment of this series of commands that Jesus is requiring of his disciples. And keep in mind, what Jesus is saying to his disciples is, you are not now starting this process of discipleship, but you're entering graduate school. You know, you've got the basics. You've been with me. I sent you out. You've healed. You've preached the gospel in my name. You've cast out demons. You've done, whatever it was. That's a pretty intense program, right? But he said, you're not at the ultimate place where you need to be. And you won't be there unless you deny yourself, take up your cross resolutely, and then in that condition, follow me. Again, leaving this. So why is it that they, just to skip to why is it that they have the two stages and then the third? Because the two stages are done between like ages 5 and 12. And then when you get up that, bar mitzvah kind of thing and on, as adult life, you don't have the liberties and freedom that you had prior to that. So you learn the basics when you're unencumbered by married life, children, vocation, all that stuff. That's when you give complete and entire focus to this. But now in the third, you are living with, your life is now associated with that rabbi. And you're staying with him, you're observing him, you're watching him, you're not questioning him. Your goal is to imitate him 100%. You want to be the replica of what he is. So whatever that takes, observing him, copying him, mimicking him, listening to him, all of those things, then and only then, after you've proven that that's who you are, that that's what you have, are you sent out. You're sent out to now as a representative of that rabbinical school, of that person's rabbinical teaching and theology and philosophy and all of that. But then, and you are making disciples of this rabbi. So you had the schools of Shammai, the schools of Hillel, but they were just outstanding. There were others, right? And all these various rabbinical schools. And then ultimately, you innovate your own tradition and you have your own disciples. That's the ultimate. That's where all of that goes. And I think it's interesting that Paul tells Timothy, be an example of so Jesus is an exemplar to the 12 who are an exemplar to the disciples in the early church, and then they are going to be examples to others. This whole process just continues and continues and continues and continues and continues. And you say, well, this whole thing, going to Matthew 28 and all that like that, well, that's just reserved for only the best and the brightest then, right? It's only reserved for the certain elite. No, because this is where Christianity breaks from Judaism in this model, because it doesn't say it's just for the elite, it's just for the super Christian. It says it's for everybody. This is the level of discipleship that Jesus would have for everyone. And we know this because I was just poking around in the Bible. So you got Judas. Well, let's look at this bunch, right? You got Judas, who betrays the Lord for 30 pieces of silver. Thomas doubts the resurrection. Unless I see, I won't, right? And then the disciples arguing over, even in the presence of Jesus. Hey, you're going to be first, I'm going to be first. Who's going to be first? Who's going to run this thing? And then Peter denying the Lord on 3 occasions. So at the end of the day, you have, it all boils down to, in this level of discipleship, what Jesus is advocating and demanding is one single criterion, and that is spending time with Him, right? So if we're going to be in that place following Him in a state of mind without, wandering off the path or doing these things, it is time spent with Him. That's the single. If a disciple had to spend all that time with a rabbi, back in New England a couple centuries ago, you had Edwards taking in a bunch of people into his home, and this was just how it was done. You took people into your home. They observed you. They watched family life. They saw you in every conceivable situation. They were free to ask all kinds of questions. They learned everything through and through from you. So how much time do we spend then with the Lord? How much time? Are we being taught by Him? Are we pouring out our hearts to Him? Are we worshiping Him? This is what keeps us in tune with Him and devoted to Him. Those 2 things comes down to, one of the things you're going to see characteristically is commitment and devotion. Commitment and devotion. Commitment and devotion. What are the barometric measures by which I can know that I am following? Because that was the original question, right? How can I know that I'm following? Am I committed? Am I devoted? Am I committed? Am I devoted? Am I committed? Am I devoted? And if the object of my devotion, remember Jesus says, if you love father, mother, whatever, more than me, these are radical things to say. You cannot be my disciple. All these are very radical things to say. So you say, where is your heart? And so if we're cultivating that devotion and that commitment, so whatever the cost of discipleship, we don't recoil. Whatever the distance of the path, we don't recoil, because He has our hearts. You have my loyalty, my devotion, my commitment, and we confess that to Him every day. And whatever we confess to Him every day, we align our behavior and our decisions and our life along with that. But we got to close. Lord, thank You for this opportunity to plunge some more into this subject, which just seems to be an endless subject. But we thank You for Your guidance in connecting the passages in a way that would glorify You, helping us to learn to understand this discipleship relationship with You. We want to not just be followers, but we want to be following. There's no question, that's all of us. We want to be following. So guide us in our steps this week as we follow, as we meet others in the way, that You might give a sense of urgency to those conversations, and a sense of favorability, to those that You are calling out from our friends, family, and neighbors in this county. We'll pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.